Shalom, and welcome to this presentation on the Revolutionary War battles that took place here in the Deep South, along our Gulf Coast, and in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And no, you probably hadn't heard of them because I hadn't either until recently. Let's see if we can sort anything out about why. So, why is the Gulf Coast and Mississippi River so important? Why has it always been so important to American security? This is a map of the drainage basin of the whole United States. It's so pretty to me. The huge pink chunk in the middle, that's the drainage basin of the Mississippi River. The little thing that sticks out into the Gulf down there is actually the mouth of the Mississippi. And the royal blue section, just to the east of that, just to the right, is the drainage basin of Mobile Bay, which reaches into 3 states. So if you can control access down here, you can keep enemies from getting all the way up into your heartland. And you can ship goods, including war material, up and down these rivers to aid, for example, the Patriot cause. The year is 1778, 15 years after the end of the 7 Years' War. You will remember that the French have lost their American colonial possessions. You got to go all the way down here into the Caribbean to find anything that is French. And Spain now controls Louisiana, which is the whole area from the Gulf to the Great Lakes and from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. The British have Florida down here, and they've been struggling to get situated there with very little support from home. They divided it into 2 colonies, from Perdido Key to the river, which is sort of South Alabama, South Mississippi. That was called British West Florida. Pensacola was the capital. It remained loyal when the Americans declared their independence. In fact, a lot of Tories, loyalists from the older colonies on the seaboard, sought refuge in the British Floridas, east and west. This is a detail of a period map of British West Florida. In the western part, nearest Louisiana, the towns of Mobile, Natchez, Baton Rouge supported a French-speaking population who mostly lived on small plantations. The black folks, free or enslaved, who were in the colony were mostly in the west, and the most influential native group in the area is Choctaw. On the east side of West Florida, we're still in the same colony, around Pensacola, the population is more solidly English-speaking and it's sparser. Their neighbors are Creek, and the Creek shift their alliances more readily than the Choctaw, who tend to favor the French. Meanwhile, Spanish Louisiana was preparing for whatever might come. After a little bit of a rough transition, a young governor, he was 29, came from Spain, this guy, Bernardo de Galvez, and he found his king much more supportive than George III. Appointed 2 years into the American Revolution, Galvez was to support the Patriot cause and govern that vast Louisiana territory, pacify the French, befriend the natives, rebuild the defenses. No small task. On top of that, he also received explicit instructions to curb illegal trade, that is British trade, on the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain. Here it's worth noting that Governor Galvez began supporting the Patriot cause as soon as he arrived. That was 77. He sent over $70,000 worth of war material up the Mississippi River to Fort Pitt. He sent cattle, he sent provisions, cash, ammunition, shoes. From Fort Pitt, they would be sent east to western Pennsylvania where the troops could use them. He also allowed Americans to enter British West Florida from the river, which he controlled, remember. They came down to look for support among the settlers in West Florida and also to harass British positions there. Now, Galvez tolerated some British shipping on the Mississippi for the sake of the ordinary settlers in West Florida. This was a typical choice for the governor. He was always concerned for the well-being of non-combatants. So he allowed them to be there, but when British ships were carrying contraband and harassing Allied shipping, he couldn't tolerate that. This was a practice he had been instructed to stop. It's not a surprise to me, honestly, that the British imagined that they could take advantage of Galvez's generosity. But when he learned that the British were plundering houses and plantations and towns along the riverbanks, he acted decisively. On April 17th of 1777, he led an expedition which took 11 British ships in one night. It was everything he could find. When the British showed up in New Orleans to request the return of their property, which I'm sure they were very polite about, Galvez sent them packing and then devised a plan to sweep the British off of the Gulf Coast altogether. In preparing for his campaign, Galvez had one very important strategic advantage: spies. Carlos III paid for a substantial spy network, and Galvez was very careful about choosing and preparing men he could trust. He had spies that were up the Mississippi River to the northeast in the rebellious colonies, south in the Caribbean and Mexico. But he also had spies in the main British settlements in West Florida. So he often knew what they were doing before they did. So, for example, in June of 1779, 4 days after Galvez's country declared war on Britain, General Campbell received orders. Remember, he's in Pensacola, and it takes weeks for correspondence to reach him from London. But he receives orders 4 days after the declaration. And what he was told to do was to take his one gunboat that he had in Pensacola Bay and go and attack New Orleans. What they didn't know was that Galvez's spy intercepted the letter, so he calculated his risk and he struck first. So it's August of 1779. A hurricane comes along in the summer there and it devastates New Orleans defenses. It's also going to wreck a whole bunch of Galvez's ships on the river. Now think about the news that he's just gotten, that the English are planning an assault on New Orleans. So what do? Well, Galvez took a couple of days to shore up things as best he could and take care of his people in New Orleans. And then he led 1,500 soldiers and militia against a British position at a town called Manchac. The name of the fort is Fort Butte. Why would he do that? Because the British didn't have a lot of ships. They didn't have a lot of men. So if he took the fight to them, he could keep them away from New Orleans. The guy in charge at Fort Butte was Alexander Dixon. I told you we'd come back to him. Dixon decided that the fort he had been told to hold was not defensible. So he fled, leaving about 20 German mercenaries alone there to hold the fort and to buy him and his troops time to get to Baton Rouge. I suppose Dixon was right about Fort Butte because it fell in about 10 minutes. Of course, General Galvez is not done. From Manchac, he will move on to a brand new fort that Dixon had built at Baton Rouge. It's called Fort New Richmond. And I think surely Dixon must have trusted it since he had just had it constructed. Galvez spends a couple of weeks there. His men dig trenches, they barrage the fort, and after a couple of weeks, Dixon capitulates again. The question of why he capitulates is still one for historians to wonder about. But the next thing he does is even more surprising. Galvez refuses to accept his surrender at Baton Rouge unless he's also willing to surrender Fort Panmure at Natchez. Natchez is the largest and best defended settlement in the area. It had been growing rapidly for a while. The Natchez district was relatively well populated and well defended. Dixon accepts those terms. I'm sure you can imagine how the commander at Panmure at Natchez felt when he received a letter from his commander saying that the fortress now belonged to the Spanish and he was to surrender it, stack arms, and walk away. Now, His Majesty's ship West Florida, one of only 2 British gunboats in the theater, had been patrolling Lake Pontchartrain, searching all manner of shipping, including private Spanish merchant vessels, since 1776. Also since 76, William Pickles, an American naval officer, had been patrolling the Gulf Coast in a ship called Morris. When Morris was destroyed in a hurricane, Galvez gave him another one. According to the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, this second USS Morris was a schooner in the Continental Navy, presented to Oliver Pollock by Governor Bernardo de Galvez of Spanish Louisiana in the summer of 1779. Let me clarify that. General Galvez gave Pollock, who represented the Continental Congress, the gift of an armed schooner. Pickles was given the command. So while Dixon was recovering his lost dignity and Galvez was regrouping at New Orleans, an American named Billy Pickles took his USS Morris to the fight on the lake. Pickles intrepidly drew alongside the better armed and manned West Florida, boarded her, beat the Englishmen, and took her home. West Florida was out of the game. In our next video, General Galvez is going to move on to his next target. You knew he wasn't done yet, right? But first I want to pause to consider the man's expertise and foresight. He was only 29. He was already a general. In the little bit of time he had, he managed to build his defenses, build an army, gather a fleet, find and prepare spies and place them so that he had the intelligence he needed. He developed cooperative relationships with the Americans, the French, and the native allies, even if he didn't really trust them. By contrast, Alexander Dixon, right across the river, is going to abandon his position because he feels his fortress is not defensible, but he had time to make it defensible. The fact is the English simply did not prepare their defenses until the very last minute. I think because they didn't fully understand the importance of the Mississippi River and its watersheds in the way the French did. It's worth noting that at the very end of the War of 1812, the British are going to come back. They may have figured it out by then because they want New Orleans and they want the Great Lakes. That is, they want control of the Mississippi River. That's also going to be a disaster, but it's also a story for another day.